Hello. In this video, I'm going to be talking through the source question structure and technique for paper 3, which is Civil Rights in the USA 1850 to 2009. This is section A of paper 3, so it's the first part of the paper. It's a compulsory section, so you don't have a choice in terms of what you answer here. You have to do this question, so it's very important that you get your head around this and you feel confident on it. This question is always going to be on a depth topic, so topics 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So topic 1 is Reconstruction, topic 2 is Jim Crow, topic 3 is the New Deal, topic 4 is civil rights in the 50s and 60s, and topic 5 is Obama. So it's always going to be on one of those topics. Okay, so you should have a good level of own knowledge about those topics. So yeah, it's something you should be working hard on. You can see Obama here. He's writing a source question in the Oval Office when he is president. Obviously, that's a joke. He didn't do this course. Okay, so going on to just some general guidance about the source question. This is a lot of this is actually information that I received when I went on a course by an examiner who gave this information. So what he said was that the structure is very important for these questions. So I'm going to go into that in more detail, but the examiners obviously are looking for a good structure to these answers, and I'll give you the suggested structure in just a minute. And what you need to do, it's all about the key term in the question is value. Okay, so you need to come back to that question of value and that word consistently throughout the answer. And what the source question isn't, it isn't asking you to kind of pull it apart and to heavily criticize it and to say how it's not helpful. It's really to highlight the value and to explain why it's useful. So you can think about kind of criteria for that. So maybe the source gives a particular insight to something, it gives a perspective on something, it matches your own knowledge. All sources have value in some way or other, don't they? Even the most one-sided summary of an event gives value. Has value. It gives an insight from a perspective. Think of something that's very, very one-sided. It's still got value. It's still got use for a historian. So you can use these kind of words here. The weight that the source has, what can we infer, how is it useful, is it accurate, is it typical, and then the utility, the usefulness of the source. So we'll go through those in more detail in just a minute, but this is what you've got to be kind of thinking of for this question, the value of the source. Here is Simon Sharma giving us some key advice, and he says to look at the information at the top of the source, the provenance information. That's very important. Look out for the date and the audience. And I think that is one of the most important bits of this. Actually, the provenance information is as important, if not more important, than the actual content of the source, right? In terms of the way that we answer this. So please remember that bit of guidance from Simon Sharma there, to look at the provenance info in lots of detail. Just a little bit more general guidance. The source can have more value for one inquiry than another. So in this question, you have one source and two inquiries, unlike in the French Revolution where you have two sources and one inquiry. So for this one, we've got one source, two inquiries, and it's highly likely that it's going to be more useful for one inquiry than the other. Okay. Another important bit of guidance is only criticize something that's missing from the source if it's crucial to the inquiry. The sources are just small extracts. You can't expect them to cover everything. If they leave something out on purpose, you could say that if they're purposely leaving something out, or if if something's missing that is crucial to the inquiry, you could say the fact that it doesn't cover that means that it has less value for inquiry 2, for example. Okay, and I will go through an example in just a minute that we'll see an example of that. So here is the structure. So I had it confirmed again from this examiner that you don't need an introduction. Okay, so it's got 3 internal paragraphs and a conclusion. So the paragraphs 1 and 2 are about the inquiry. So you're weighing up the value of the source, making inferences based on quotes from the source, from extracts from the source, using your own knowledge to either support or challenge what is being said. But again, we're talking about the value. So really, we're trying to support it unless, as I said, something is being left out. And then paragraph 3 is provenance for both inquiries. Okay, so explain how the provenance of the source influences its value for each inquiry. So for that one, we're thinking nature, origin, purpose for both inquiries. And then in conclusion, how useful is the source for each inquiry? And on the right-hand side, you can see these key terms. I mentioned a few of them before. These are the kind of terms you should be using. And when we look at exemplar answers that we get from the exam board, you know, they do use these terms. So don't feel like, oh, it seems obvious to use the word inference or infer or nature, origin, purpose. That's what's expected. And in terms of ticking the box, ticking the boxes of the mark scheme, you know, it just helps you to use these kind of words. Okay, so obviously you can pause that and take a note of the keywords there that you can try and bring into your answer. Here's another slide just giving the structure again in a little bit, so just presented in a slightly different way. So as I said, no introduction for the source question for civil rights. And the way you structure paragraphs 1 and 2 is where you give a point in terms of this is what the paragraph is focused on, then content. So give a quote, something that the source has said. Then you make an inference. So from this, we can see that. Yeah, so you're just explaining. Then you're using your own knowledge. So this is shown in this event. Therefore, the source has value. So you kind of like linking back there to the value of the source. And try and do that 3 times. I think 3 times is a good amount of time to use a piece of information from the source, to make an inference, to use your own knowledge, and then link back to whether it has value or not. At the end, you can also potentially talk about limitations as long as that's valid. And so you do that. Paragraph 1 is for inquiry 1, paragraph 2 is for inquiry 2, and then paragraph 3 is the provenance for both inquiries. So how does the nature of the source influence its value for inquiry 1 and 2? How does the origin of the source do that? And how does the purpose of the source do that? Also, you can think about the audience as well there. So provenance can be nature, origin, purpose, and also audience. And then in conclusion, as I said before, which inquiry is the source most useful for and why? So we're going to do, I'm going to show a practice question in just a minute, but I would say to try and follow this, these steps, I should say, in the exam when you're doing this source question. I think it makes it much easier for you in time conditions in the exam if you, as you're doing the source question, you get used to doing these steps in this order. So when you're revising, you know, you could look at past papers and you could follow these steps. So just to go through them. So the first thing, obviously you start off with the question and you highlight both inquiries or underline both inquiries. If you've got if you've got highlighters or you've got different colors, you could do inquiry 1 in one color, inquiry 2 in a different color. And then what I think you should do is do a quick mind map, so a quick kind of arrow off the inquiries with your own knowledge of those 2 inquiries. So what do you know about each of them? Just some own knowledge. Don't even look at the source yet. Just briefly, what knowledge do you know? And especially when you're kind of fresh in the exam, going into the exam, you've got lots of knowledge at your fingertips. Just get stuck into it. Get some points down. Then when you've done that quick mind map, look at, before you even read the source, look at the provenance information. Okay, so this is going back to the tip from Simon Sharma. Highlight the key information relating to nature, origin, purpose, audience, and think about, you've read the question, think about how that will help or it might hinder, the inquiries. Okay, so think about the provenance, get stuck into that. Then read the source and highlight or underline the key quotes to illustrate the inquiries. Okay, so pick out key parts of the source that relate to the inquiries. All right, so those 4 steps, I would say that's the process before you start writing. And then obviously paragraph 1 is inquiry 1, paragraph 2 is inquiry 2, paragraph 3 is provenance conclusion. Right. So we're going to go through the 2017 exam just as an example, and I've got a bit of an exemplar that was given by the exam board just to kind of illustrate what I've been talking about here. So here is the question. Assess the value of the source for revealing the extent of racist attitudes in the South. So that's inquiry 1, the extent of racist attitudes in the South, and the relationship between the federal government and southern states in the 1890s. So that's inquiry 2. So what you should do is highlight those and then think, what do I know about the extent of racist attitudes in the South? So it's obviously talking about the 1890s. And then what do I know about the relationship between the federal government and southern states? So in terms of extent of racist attitudes in the South at that time, you're probably going to be thinking about things like violence, intimidation, so things like lynching. You might think about, groups like the White Leagues. You're going to be talking about the exclusion of black voters, the extension of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, all of those things that we've learned about in topic 2. In terms of the relationship between the federal government and southern states in the 1890s, well, that's after the end of Reconstruction. So this is the federal government taking a kind of hands-off approach, letting the southern states take control of civil rights issues. So we're thinking about the Supreme Court cases that gave the power back to the southern states and upheld the Jim Crow laws. So we're thinking about things like Plessy versus Ferguson is the big one, but we've also got cases like Mississippi versus Williams, Cumming versus Board of Education. You could also talk about the end of Reconstruction, 1877, etc. So that's the kind of own knowledge. That's the level of detail, I think, at that point. So they're the 2 inquiries with some own knowledge. And this is the provenance information. Okay, so the source is from a speech made by Ida B. Wells at a church in Boston, Massachusetts, lynch law in all its phases, 13th of February, 1893. The speaker was a Black American journalist from Memphis, Tennessee, who had seen the violent lynching of some of her friends in 1892. Here she addresses federal and state government responses to lynching. So, nature, origin, purpose. So it's a speech. So you think about how does that affect things if it's a speech? Think about what is a speech trying to do? What's the purpose of a speech? Okay, so you could talk about it's to persuade, it's to give her perspective on things. She was a journalist, so she's from Memphis, Tennessee, which is in the South. So she's likely to have a good insight into these issues. In fact, it says she'd seen the violent lynching of some of her friends. So she has first-hand experience of the violent racism of the South in the 1890s. She's talking about federal and state government responses to lynching. So, that's useful for inquiry too. This is quite interesting as well. It's at a church in Boston, Massachusetts. So Boston is obviously in the north. So think about that the audience is in the north. It doesn't say here, but if she's a Black American journalist, this is at a church, it's likely the audience were Black, although not necessarily. They could have been kind of like more liberal white people. But that's something to think about. The audience is certainly going to be more kind of supportive of her ideas than if this was happening in the South. So that's something to think about as well. There may be other things that I've kind of skipped over there, but that's the kind of level of detail in terms of provenance, nature, origin, purpose, okay, and audience. So here is the source. I'm not going to read through it all. So what you can do at this point is just pause this and read through it all, and then start the video again. So if you just pause it now. Okay, so hopefully you've paused it and you've read through that. If not, I'm going to go through it, go through the exemplar. So hopefully it'll be useful, but it's useful to go through this and think about which aspects of this are useful for inquiry 1 and inquiry 2. So pull out key quotes. So here is just a little bit of a second paragraph. Okay, and this is something that was provided by the exam board in the examiner's report after 2017, and it said that this was a top level answer. Okay, so this is what the exam board considers a top level answer. And so this is the second paragraph. Okay, so it's talking about making inferences based on the source using own knowledge. So it says, moreover, source 1 is considerably useful in its analysis of the complex relationship of the federal government with southern states and how this too allowed racism to be expressed to the farcical extent that it was. So that's the point. Okay, the claim of the authorities of Louisiana that the Italian lynching was strictly within the authority of the state refers to the principle of federalism in the US Constitution. According to this, states were entitled to near autonomy over matters within its jurisdiction. Indeed, in 1883, the Supreme Court cases proved the willingness of the federal government to intervene in state matters. Wells criticizes this lack of jurisdiction of the federal government over the crimes committed upon citizens of the country. So it's giving own knowledge, it's engaging with the content of the source, furthering the view that racism and violence, though it occurred in the South, transcended state boundaries, and that the federal government having to pay $25,000 for the crimes of the state whilst not being allowed to intervene was inherently hypocritical. So that's the kind of key aspect of this, isn't it, that Ida B. Wells is focusing on. This demonstrates how racist attitudes were justified both locally by indifference and nationally by constitutional values. So it's kind of making this kind of inference, and it's kind of like highlighting the value of the source in the point that it's making about the federal and state relationship. Okay, so it's using it or various quotes, using its own knowledge to kind of explain the value of the source. So that's what you do in the 2 paragraphs to begin with on the 2 inquiries. In terms of the provenance, here's a section on that. It says, the provenance of the source as a speech also grants it value, both in implying how racist attitudes were perceived by activists and how racist attitudes were actually being countered, showing their limited extent. Wells giving her speech in Massachusetts is significant in suggesting that activists thought that only audiences receptive to anti-racist arguments resided in the North. So talking about audience there. So it's talking about speech and how that's useful, the fact she's an activist, and the fact that this is in the North, and what we can, like, the value of that, what we can learn from that. Another bit of a provenance paragraph, it says, however, source 1 is also limited, particularly in its lack of analysis of the role of the Supreme Court in embodying both racist attitudes and the weakness of the federal government. Wells neglects to mention the 1883 cases in which the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was declared unconstitutional, and the legislation of segregation such as transport in Florida in 1887, both of which enabled racism to flourish in the 1890s. So this one, and it's doing it very well, it's explaining what the source leaves out. Okay, so the limitations of the source in terms of what it's leaving out. Okay, so that's particularly useful, and using good own knowledge there. And then here's a exemplar conclusion. So this from a different answer, the same question, but just a different answer. Overall, the source is of value to both inquiries, though more so for the first. The source refers to the relationship between the federal and state governments in order to demonstrate the extent of racist attitudes, leading the focus of the source to be on the latter. So it's focusing on racist attitudes. So therefore, because of its focus, it's more valuable for the first inquiry. Furthermore, the author's expertise in relation to the first inquiry gives her report's accurate account of the issue's solid credibility. So again, the actual origin of the source, the fact that it's who it's from, gives it more credibility. So that's the criteria that are used to reach a judgment. So the criteria here is the focus. So this answer is saying the focus of the source is a useful way to reach a judgment, and so is the origin of the source. Okay. So in terms of the general mark scheme, just quickly run through, this is the general mark scheme, level 5. So to get an A star, this is what you need to do. So interrogates the evidence of source in relation to both inquiries with confidence and discrimination. So what that means is you're, selectively picking pieces of the source out, and you're, as it says here, making reasoned inferences and showing how the material can be used. So basically, this is what we're doing in paragraphs 1 and 2. We're picking out relevant bits of the source, and we're making inferences from it. So this shows us that, that kind of sentence. Next bullet point, deploys knowledge of the historical context to illuminate and or discuss the limitations of what can be gained from the content of the source material. So this is your own knowledge, okay? So to illuminate, so to kind of highlight things and to discuss limitations, displaying secure understanding of the need to interpret source material in the context of the values and concerns of the society from which it is drawn. So that's a key kind of term, the values and concerns of the society. So it's focusing on this because this is what people were concerned with at the time. Yeah, that's the kind of, that's what it's getting at. Evaluation of source material uses valid criteria which are justified and fully applied. Evaluation takes into account the weight of evidence. So how much does this match your own knowledge? Okay. And then the certainty with which aspects of it can be used as basis for claim. So this is more valid than this, for example. Okay, so this is the generic mark scheme. So we're talking about making inferences, using own knowledge, and then valid criteria. So as I said before, it could be what the source is focused on, the use of evidence, it could be the origin of the source, etc. So here is the mark scheme for the specific question. Okay. So just to go through this, it says candidates must analyze and evaluate the source to consider its value in reviewing racist attitudes in the South and the relationship between the federal government and southern states. The author of the extract is not named in the specification, and candidates therefore cannot be expected to know about her. So you may know about Ida B. Wells, but actually she's not, because she's not named in the specification. The examiner's not going to kind of take marks off if you don't specifically talk about, her background. Okay. So here are some points about the origin and nature of the source. So she was in a good position to know because she was Black American from the South. The fact that some of her friends were lynched would make her more bitter against white people in the government. Basically, her background might make her more critical of the Constitution. The audience was in a liberal northern state. Okay, so we've talked about those things. And then for the two inquiries here, so in terms of racist attitudes, this is what we get from the source. It provides evidence that there was racism in the South, there's censorship, double standards, and the South is out of touch with the rest of the nation. So you get that from those quotes. In terms of the federal government, it's saying that states' rights are powerful in the South. Federal government has basically said that southern states can deal with Black citizens. They use it. Southern states are using states' rights as a smokescreen, and it says that the relationship between the federal government and state governments are dysfunctional. So these are the kind of inferences basically that you can pull out. Again, obviously you can pause this and look at what you pulled out and see if that kind of matches. And then finally, in terms of the mark scheme, what knowledge could you use? And so it's saying the Supreme Court judgment of 1883, the 1877 compromise, lynching, and basically you could talk about Southern Republicans and how they were more kind of like pro civil rights. But this is kind of what we talked about there. So just in summary, with the source question, just to emphasize, you are looking for the value. So you've got two paragraphs, one on each inquiry, using the content to make inferences, use your own knowledge to kind of like back that up or challenge that. And then the third paragraph is on provenance, where you're talking about nature, origin, purpose, and how that either helps or hinders the value of the source for both inquiries. And then a conclusion, which inquiries are most useful for and why. And focusing on value. I think that's the key thing. What is the value of the source? Okay, I hope that was helpful in helping you answer those civil rights source questions. Thanks.